Chapter 1. The Ballroom and the Blood Oath. The chandeliers dripped with crystal tears, each one catching the candlelight and throwing it back in fractured rainbows. Alina Ashford stood at the edge of the ballroom, her gloved hands clutching a glass of untouched champagne, watching the dancers spin like elegant ghosts across the marble floor. She shouldn't have come. The invitation had been a mistake, a clerical error perhaps, or someone's cruel joke. 3 months ago, she'd been the celebrated violinist of the Royal Orchestra. Now she was nothing dismissed after her former mentor publicly accused her of plagiarism, of stealing his compositions and claiming them as her own. The lie had spread like poison through London's musical circles. No one had believed her denials. No one had cared about the truth. She'd come tonight because hiding felt worse than humiliation, because some stubborn part of her refused to let him take everything. The ballroom belonged to House Thornwood, one of London's oldest aristocratic families, known for their midnight galas and peculiar customs. Guests were required to wear black or deep jewel tones. No mirrors adorned the walls, and the ball didn't begin until well past 11 o'clock, when proper society had already retired. Alina had thought them eccentric. She hadn't known the truth. Movement caught her Aja figure crossing the ballroom with the fluid grace of a predator. He was tall, dressed in black that seemed to absorb the light. His dark hair pulled back to reveal a face of sharp angles and unsettling beauty, but it was his eyes that stopped her breath. Even from across the room, she could see they were wrong, too bright, too knowing. Ancient. He moved toward the dais where a grand piano waited, untouched all evening. The crowd parted for him without seeming to notice they were doing so. Whispers rippled through the ballroom, not gossip, but something else, something that tasted of fear and reverence. Alina watched as an elderly woman in violet silk approached him, her movements stiff with age but her bearing regal. The man bowed, a gesture so old-fashioned it seemed pulled from another century, and offered his arm. The woman took it, and together they climbed the dais steps. The ballroom fell silent. The man seated himself at the piano. The elderly woman stood beside it, one weathered hand resting on the polished wood. And then he began to play. The music was like nothing Alina had ever heard. It shouldn't have been possible on a piano. The notes seemed to layer and echo, building a melody that felt older than stone, sadder than death. It was a lament, she realized, a mourning song for something long lost. The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears. Around the ballroom, guests stood frozen, some with their own eyes glistening, caught in whatever spell the music wove. Alina felt it to the ache of it. The beauty and the grief braided together until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Her chest tightened. She'd thought she'd cried all her tears these past months, but apparently she'd been wrong. The final notes faded into silence. The elderly woman leaned down and kissed the pianist's forehead, whispering something Alina couldn't hear. Then, she descended the dais with quiet dignity and disappeared into the crowd. The man at the piano remained seated, his hands still resting on the keys, his head bowed. For a moment, he looked almost human, almost vulnerable. Then his head lifted, and his gaze swept across the ballroom. It found Alina. She should have looked away, should have turned and fled into the safer shadows at the room's edge. But she was frozen, pinned by those impossible eyes, and in them she saw recognition, as if he knew her, as if he'd been waiting for her. He rose from the piano bench in one fluid movement, and began walking toward her. The crowd parted again. Guests murmured, their voices edged with warning, or perhaps envy. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet refused to move. He stopped 3 paces away. Up close, he was devastating beautiful, in the way that dangerous things often were. His skin was too pale, smooth as marble. His dark eyes held galaxies of time she couldn't begin to fathom. "You're not one of them," he said. His voice was low, touched with an accent she couldn't place. Old European, perhaps medieval. Elena's throat was dry. "I don't understand. The guests here, they know what they are attending, what we are." His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You came ignorant, brave or foolish. I haven't decided which. I received an invitation," she managed. "Yes." His gaze traveled over her face, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "An error, or perhaps fate, has a sense of humor. Tell me, violinist, did you enjoy the music?" She blinked. "How did you know I—" "Your hands," he gestured to where she still clutched the champagne glass. "The calluses on your fingertips, the way you've been listening to the orchestra all evening with a critic's ear. You hear music differently than the others here." Elena's face heated. I'm not a violinist anymore. Something flickered in his expression, interest, perhaps, or recognition of grief in another. And yet you came to a ball. Curious. Who are you? The question escaped before she could stop it. Lord Lucian thought, this is my house, my territory. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something darker. And you, Elena Ashford, are standing in a room full of vampires. The word hung in the air between them. Elena's first instinct was to laugh. This had to be some elaborate theatrical joke, but then she saw his expression, grave and patient, and she remembered the two bright eyes, the unnatural grace, the way the crowd had reacted to him, with that mix of fear and worship. She remembered the old woman's reverent kiss. Her champagne glass slipped from nerveless fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Chapter 2, The Price of Knowing. The shattered glass glittered like diamonds across the floor. Elena stared at the fragments, her mind refusing to process what Lord Thornwood had just said. Vampires. The word echoed in her skull, absurd and impossible and yet steady. His hand closed around her elbow, supporting her weight, though she hadn't realized she was swaying. His touch was cool through the fabric of her sleeve, not cold exactly, but absent of human warmth. Breathe, you're about to faint, and I'd rather not have to explain to the others why I'm carrying an unconscious mortal through the ballroom. The others, Elena repeated faintly. She looked around the room with new eyes, the elegant dancers, the aristocrats in their jewel-toned finery, the servants moving silently between guests with trays of wine so dark it looked black. They're all, not all, some are human, consorts, companions, donors who've entered into formal agreements with various houses. His grip on her elbow tightened fractionally. But you are unaffiliated, unprotected, which makes your presence here extremely complicated. Elena finally managed to look at him again. He was watching her with that same unsettling intensity, and she realized he was waiting for something, for her to scream, perhaps, to run, to do any of the sensible things a woman should do upon discovering she'd walked into a nest of monsters. Instead, she heard herself ask, the woman you played for, who was she? Surprise flickered across his features. Not the question I expected. You played her a morning song, something personal. I want to know who she was. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his expression softened into something almost human. Lady Catherine Blackwell. She lost her husband 200 years ago in a duel over a house territory. Every decade, on the anniversary of his death, I play for her. It's an old debt, long since paid in any practical sense, but some obligations transcend accounting. 200 years. The casual way he said it made Elena's head spin. How old are you? Old enough to know that mortals who learn too much about our world rarely live long enough to regret it. His voice was matter-of-fact, not threatening, which somehow made it worse. The question now, Miss Ashford, is what to do with you. Fear finally broke through her shock. Are you going to kill me? I don't want to. He said it like he was discussing the weather, then added with what might have been frustration, you shouldn't be here. The invitations are keyed, spelled, if you will, to reveal their true nature only to those who already know what we are. Somehow, you slipped through. I didn't know, Elena said quickly. I swear, I had no idea. I'll leave. I'll forget everything. I won't tell anyone you can't forget. Lord Thornwood's jaw tightened. The moment you saw me clearly, recognized what I am, the compulsion ward broke. The knowledge is permanent now. And there are laws, Miss Ashford, ancient ones. No mortal can know of our existence without entering into a formal agreement with a house, for protection, for insurance against exposure. What kind of agreement? That depends on the house. Some require service, others take blood type. A few simply demand silence, backed by magical enforcement. He paused, studying her face, and some houses would simply eliminate the problem. Elena's heart was racing now. Which kind are you? The kind that's tired of unnecessary death. He released her elbow and stepped back, putting proper distance between them. Around them, the ball continued, though Elena noticed several vampires watching them with predatory interest. But I can't let you simply walk out of here unbound. The other houses would see it as weakness, an invitation for chaos. So I'm trapped. So you need protection. He gestured toward the edge of the ballroom. Come, we'll discuss this somewhere more private. And Miss Ashford, don't run. Several of my guests are very old and very hungry, and they view mortals who flee as prey rather than people. It was the most terrifying etiquette lesson Elena had ever received. She walked beside him through the ballroom, acutely aware of the eyes tracking their movement. The vampires and, she could see it now, could recognize the too still way they held themselves, the predatory grace, the ageless quality of their faces watched her with varying degrees of interest, hunger, curiosity. One woman in crimson silk smiled at her, revealing teeth just slightly too sharp. Elena forced herself to keep walking, to keep her chin up and her pace steady. She'd spent years performing before critical audiences. She could pretend not to be terrified for a few more minutes. Lord Thornwood led her through a side door into a corridor lined with paintings. Here, finally, away from the crowd, Elena allowed herself to tremble. "You're doing well," he said quietly. "Better than most would." "I don't feel like I'm doing well. I feel like I'm in a nightmare." "Fair enough." He stopped before a heavy oak door and pushed it open, revealing a library. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves surrounded a fireplace where flames cast dancing shadows across worn leather furniture. "Sit. I'll explain what happens next." Elena sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. Lord Thornwood remained standing by the fireplace, his profile sharp in the firelight. "The simplest solution," he said, "is for you to accept my protection. A formal bond between you and House Thornwood. It would prevent other houses from touching you, and give you safe passage through vampire territory. In exchange for what? Your discretion, your presence at certain house functions, to maintain appearances." And he hesitated, the first uncertain gesture she'd seen from him. "Blood, on occasion, not often, not enough to harm you, but the bond requires it." Elena's hand went to her throat instinctively. "You want to feed from me. I want to keep you alive," he corrected, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. "Everything else is merely the price of that survival." She looked at him, this ancient, dangerous creature who'd played a mourning song for a grieving widow, and who was offering her protection instead of death, and realized she was about to make a choice that would change everything. "How long would this bond last?" she whispered. His eyes met hers, dark and fathomless. "As long as you draw breath, Elena Ashford, or until you no longer wish it." Chapter 3. The mark of House Thornwood. Fire crackled in the silence that followed. Elena's mind raced through impossible calculations, weighing survival against surrender, freedom against the very real threat she'd seen in those other vampires' eyes. Lord Thornwood waited with the patience of something that had centuries to spare, his dark gaze never leaving her face. "If I refuse?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Then, I escort you from the premises, and wash my hands of your fate. Another house will claim you within hours. They can smell unbound mortals the way wolves smell blood. And I promise you, Miss Ashford, their terms will be far less generous than mine." Elena's fingers curled into the leather armrest. "You're asking me to trust you, a vampire, a stranger who could be lying about all of this." "I am." Something shifted in his expression. Approval, perhaps, though if I wanted to simply take from you, I would have done so already. The ballroom is full of witnesses who would sanction my claim. Instead, I'm offering you choice. Limited choice, admittedly, but more than most mortals in your position receive. "Why?" the question burst from her. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Lord Thornwood turned back to the fire, his profile gilded in flamelight. For a long moment, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost contemplative. 300 years ago, I failed to protect someone, a mortal woman who stumbled into our world much as you did. I was young, then arrogant, convinced that mortal lives were brief and therefore inconsequential." His jaw tightened. "She was dead within a week, drained by a rival house, and left in the street like refuse. I have spent 3 centuries ensuring that never happens again in my territory." The raw honesty in his words struck something in Elena's chest. She recognized that tone, the weight of old guilt, the kind that carved itself into your bones and never quite healed. She'd heard the same thing in her own voice these past months. Whenever she thought about the students she'd taught, the music she'd lost, the career destroyed by someone else's lies. "I understand carrying something you can't put down," she said quietly, his head turned sharply toward her, and in his eyes she saw recognition, as if he was seeing her for the first time, not just a problem to solve, or a mortal to protect, but a person who understood the architecture of regret. "Then you'll accept the bond?" he asked. Elena took a breath, held it, released it slowly. "Tell me exactly what it entails. No pretty words, no omissions. I want the truth." "Very well." Lord Thornwood moved away from the fireplace and took the chair opposite hers. Even seated, he radiated a coiled energy, a predator, forcing itself into the shape of civilization. The bond requires three things. First, a blood exchange, a small amount of yours, mixed with mine. It creates a magical link that marks you as under House Thornwood's protection. Other vampires will sense it immediately. What does it feel like? Alina interrupted. The link, you'll sense my presence when I'm near. My emotional state, if it's strong enough. In return, I'll know if you're in danger. If you're hurt. He paused. It's not mind reading. Your thoughts remain your own, but there is intimacy to it, an awareness of each other that can be unsettling at first. Alina absorbed this, an invisible tether to this ancient creature, linking them in ways she couldn't fully imagine. And the second requirement, you attend house functions as my companion, balls, courts, negotiations with other houses. It signals that you're valuable to me, which increases your protection. No one will risk harming you if they believe I would retaliate. I would be a prop, Alina said flatly, a show of your property. You would be a ward under my protection, making your status clear. He held her gaze. I won't pretend it's equal partnership, Miss Ashford. Our world runs on power and possession. But I can promise you this: I will never allow you to be treated as less than human. You will have autonomy within the boundaries of the bond. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was more than the alternative offered. The third requirement, her voice was steadier than she felt. Blood, as I mentioned, perhaps once a month, depending on circumstances. Enough to maintain the bond's strength, but not enough to weaken you. His expression grew serious. I will never take without asking. You will always have the right to refuse, though I'll need adequate notice to find alternative sources. Consent matters, Miss Ashford. Not all houses honor this, but mine does. Elena's hand went to her neck again, feeling the pulse beneath her skin. The thought of those sharp teeth breaking flesh made her stomach churn. And yet, have you fed tonight? She asked suddenly. Surprise flickered across his face. Yes, before the ball. Why? Because I'm trying to understand if you're hungry right now, if that's influencing this conversation. A sound escaped him, short, sharp. It took Alina a moment to recognize it as laughter. You're very direct, aren't you? I don't see the point in being otherwise. Not now. No, I suppose not. His amusement faded into something more somber. I'm not hungry. And even if I were, I've gone centuries between meals when necessary. I'm in no danger of losing control, if that's your concern. It was one of them. What are your others? Alina met his gaze. That I'll lose myself, that this bond will hollow me out until I'm nothing but an accessory to your immortal life. That in trying to survive, I'll stop being Alina Ashford entirely. The honesty of it hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Lord Thornwood leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, and for just a moment he looked almost human, almost kind. Then we'll make it part of the bond, he said quietly. You remain yourself. You keep your name, your will, your music. I'll put it in the formal agreement, a clause that protects your autonomy as much as any magical contract can. It won't be perfect, Miss Ashford, but it will be something. Elena's eyes burned. She couldn't remember the last time someone had actually listened to her fears instead of dismissing them. All right, she whispered. I accept. Chapter 4. Blood and Binding. Lord Thornwood rose from his chair, with that fluid, inhuman grace. The ritual itself is simple but must be done correctly. Once begun, it cannot be stopped without severe consequences to both of us. Alina stood on shaking legs, her heart hammering against her ribs. Simple, he'd said, simple, as if she were about to sign a business contract rather than bind herself magically to a creature that shouldn't exist. He moved to a cabinet near the bookshelf and withdrew a small wooden box, ornately carved with symbols Alina didn't recognize. When he opened it, she glimpsed a silver knife with a blade no longer than her finger, and 2 crystal vials filled with dark liquid. What's in those? She asked. Ceremonial wine, blessed by the eldest of our kind. It helps the magic take hold. He set the box on a small table between them. You'll need to remove your glove. Left hand. Elena's fingers trembled as she peeled off the white silk glove, exposing her bare hand to the firelight. Lord Thornwood's gaze fixed on her wrist, on the blue veins visible beneath pale skin, and for just a moment something hungry flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by cool professionalism. I'll cut my palm first, he said, picking up the blade, then yours. The wounds must be pressed together while we speak the binding words. Do you understand? Yes. Her voice came out hoarse. He drew the knife across his left palm without hesitation. Blood welled up darker than human blood. almost black in the firelight. Alina watched, transfixed and horrified, as he held his bleeding hands steady. "Your turn," he said quietly. "It will hurt, but only for a moment." Alina extended her hand, forcing herself to watch as he brought the blade to her palm. The kiss of silver against skin, then a line of fire, as he drew it across. She gasped, but didn't pull away. Blood rose to meet his red, where his was black, mortal where his was ancient. "Take my hand," Lord Thornwood instructed. She pressed her bleeding palm to his. The moment their blood mingled, Alina felt it a shock that ran through her entire body, electric and overwhelming. The library seemed to tilt, and she would have fallen if his other hand hadn't caught her waist, steadying her. "I've got you," he murmured. "Now repeat after me. I, Alina Ashford, do willingly enter into bond with House Thornwood." "I, Alina Ashford," she gasped, "do willingly enter into bond with House Thornwood." Power thrummed between their joined palms, growing stronger with each word. "I offer my protection," Lord Thornwood continued, his voice taking on a resonant quality that seemed to fill the room. "My name, and my oath. Let no harm befall this mortal while she bears my mark. Let her blood be sacred, her will be honored, her life be cherished until she chooses release or draws her final breath." The formal words were beautiful in their solemnity. Alina felt tears prick her eyes as the magic wound tighter around them, binding them together in ways she was only beginning to understand. "It's done," he said softly. He released her hand, and Alina looked down at her palm. The cut was already healing, knitting together with impossible speed, but in its place, a mark remained, a delicate pattern of silver lines, like frost crystallizing across her skin. It formed the shape of a thorn-wrapped rose, the sigil of House Thornwood. "It will fade to nearly invisible in daylight," Lord Thornwood explained, examining his own palm where an identical mark now gleamed, "but we'll always be able to see it, and more importantly, other vampires will sense it." Alina touched the mark with trembling fingers. It was warm beneath her touch, pulsing faintly with its own heartbeat or perhaps with his. "I can feel you," she whispered, "in my head, not thoughts, but presence. The awareness I mentioned, it will become more familiar with time." He moved to the cabinet again and returned with 2 glasses of water and clean cloth. "You should sit. The bonding takes a toll on mortal bodies." As if summoned by his words, Elena's knees buckled. She collapsed back into the chair, suddenly exhausted in a way that went bone-deep. Lord Thornwood pressed a glass into her hand. "Drink. You've lost blood and magical energy. You'll need to eat something substantial within the hour." Alina sipped the water, trying to gather her scattered thoughts. Through the strange new awareness humming in her chest, she could sense him, a presence like cold stone, ancient and solid and watchful, not hostile, but not entirely safe either. A predator holding very still. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now I return you to the ballroom briefly, so the other houses can see the mark has taken. Then I'll have you escorted home with protection. Tomorrow evening, you'll need to return here." "Why tomorrow?" "Because there will be questions, challenges, perhaps. Other houses will want to understand why I've bonded with an unknown mortal." His jaw tightened. "And because you'll need to learn how to navigate our world, the rules, the politics, the dangers. Ignorance will get you killed even with my protection." The casual mention of her potential death sent ice through Elena's veins. "You said I would be safe." "Safer," he corrected. "Not invulnerable. You're still human, Miss Ashford, still mortal and fragile by our standards. The bond protects you from direct harm by other vampires, but there are always ways around such things. Accidents, technicalities. You'll need to learn to protect yourself." Alina set down the water glass, anger finally breaking through the exhaustion. "You're telling me I've bound myself to you, and I'm still in constant danger." "I'm telling you the truth, which you asked for." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "I won't lie to you about the risks, but I will train you, teach you, give you every tool I can to survive." That's more than most bonded mortals receive. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand he undo this magical tether, and let her return to her quiet, ruined, ordinary life. But she'd seen the hunger in those other vampires' eyes. She'd felt the truth of his words in her bones. "All right," she said finally, lifting her chin, "teach me. But understand this, Lord Thornwood, I may be bound to you, but I am not yours to command. The bond goes both ways." Something shifted in his expression: surprise, respect, and perhaps the faintest hint of a smile. "Fair enough, Alina Ashford, fair enough." Chapter 5, The Court of Whispers. The ballroom felt different when Alina re-entered it. The mark on her palm pulsed with warmth, and through it she could sense Lord Thornwood at her side, a cold, steady presence that anchored her even as her legs threatened to give way. The exhaustion from the bonding still dragged at her bones, but she forced herself to walk with her head high. Every vampire in the room turned to look at them. The weight of their attention was suffocating. Alina felt it like a physical thing of ancient, predatory gazes assessing her, measuring her worth, noting the new mark that branded her as House Thornwood's property. No, not property, she reminded herself fiercely. Ward, protected. The distinction felt thin under so many hungry eyes. Stay close, Lord Thornwood murmured, his hand settling at the small of her back. The touch was light, almost courteous, but she understood its true purpose, a public claim, a warning to the others that she was not available for the taking. A woman glided toward them, her movements too smooth to be human. She wore emerald silk that matched her eyes, and her auburn hair fell in perfect waves to her waist. Beautiful, Alina thought distantly. They were all beautiful. These monsters, wearing human faces. Lucian, the woman's voice was honey over steel. How unexpected. I didn't realize you were accepting new bonds this season, Lady Marguerite. Lord Thornwood's tone was perfectly polite and perfectly cold. May I present Miss Elena Ashford, now under House Thornwood's protection. Lady Marguerite's gaze raked over Alina like claws. Charming, though one wonders what merits such swift favor. She's not from any of the established mortal families, is she? She is a musician of considerable talent, Lord Thornwood said smoothly, and her lineage is her own concern. A musician? Lady Marguerite smiled, and Alina saw the points of her canines. How quaint. Tell me, Miss Ashford, do you understand what you've agreed to, the nature of the bond you've just accepted? Alina met the vampire's gaze, refusing to look away, even as instinct screamed at her to run. I understand that I'm under Lord Thornwood's protection, and that your interest in my circumstances is noted but unwelcome. Silence rippled outward from their small group. Several nearby vampires turned with unconcealed interest. Alina felt Lord Thornwood's surprise through the bond, a flicker of warmth, almost like approval before his expression returned to its careful neutrality. Lady Marguerite's smile sharpened. She has teeth. How refreshing. Most bonded mortals are so docile. She tilted her head, studying Alina with renewed interest. I wonder how long that spirit will last. Long enough, Lord Thornwood said, and there was warning in his voice now. If you'll excuse us, Lady Marguerite, I need to introduce Miss Ashford to the other house representatives. He guided Alina away before the vampire could respond. Through the bond, Alina felt his tension controlled but present. A taut wire stretched between calculation and something darker. That was dangerous, he said quietly as they moved through the crowd, challenging her directly. She was testing me. I refused to fail. Alina kept her voice low, aware of how many ears were listening. Was I wrong? No. His hand pressed slightly against her back. But understand that Lady Marguerite is old, powerful, and has coveted my territory for centuries. You've just made yourself a target by showing strength. She'll see you as either a threat or a prize worth taking. What's the difference? Whether she tries to kill you or turn you into leverage against me. He stopped before a knot of vampires dressed in deep burgundy and black. But we'll worry about that later. For now, smile, and let me do the talking. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions. Lord Thornwood presented her two representatives, from House Blackwell, House Silverthorn. Each vampire studied her with varying degrees of curiosity, hunger, and disdain. Alina forced herself to remain calm, to nod politely, to keep her responses brief and unremarkable. But beneath the surface, her mind raced. She catalogued everything, way certain houses stood apart from others, suggesting old feuds. The deference shown to the eldest vampires, the careful dance of power and politics that played out in every gesture and word. This was a court, she realized, ancient and deadly, operating by rules she didn't yet understand, but would need to learn if she wanted to survive. Through it all, she felt Lord Thornwood's presence through the bond. Sometimes it was merely watchful, a sentinel keeping guard. Other times, when certain vampires looked at her too long or too hungrily, she felt his anger cold and controlled but absolutely lethal. Finally, mercifully, he led her toward the ballroom's exit. That's enough for tonight, he said. You're exhausted, and there's no benefit to prolonging this. Alina didn't argue. Her legs felt like water, and the room had begun to spin at the edges. The bonding, the blood loss, the constant fear, it was all catching up to her at once. Lord Thornwood guided her through a side door into a quieter corridor. A mortal servant waited there, a young man with the same silver mark Alina now bore on his wrist, though his was older, the lines more faded. "James will see you home safely," Lord Thornwood said. "The carriage is warded against vampire intrusion. You'll be perfectly safe. What about you?" The question escaped before Alina could stop it. His expression softened slightly. "I have house business to attend to, assurances to make, alliances to shore up. Your bonding will have consequences I need to manage." He paused, studying her face. "You did well tonight, Alina. Better than I expected." The use of her first name, without the formal Miss Ashford, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Or perhaps that was just the bond, reflecting his approval back at her. "Tomorrow evening," he continued, "James will collect you at sunset. Bring practical clothing. You'll be learning, not performing." And Alina, his dark eyes held hers. "Get some rest. The real challenges begin tomorrow." He turned and walked back toward the ballroom, leaving Alina alone with the servant and 100 questions burning in her mind. James cleared his throat gently. "This way, Miss. The carriage is just outside." Alina followed him on unsteady legs, acutely aware of the mark on her palm, the exhaustion in her bones, and the cold presence of Lord Thornwood still humming faintly in her chest, even as the distance between them grew. She'd survived her first night in the vampire's world. Tomorrow, she would learn whether survival was enough. Chapter 6. Lessons in Darkness. Lina woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window, and the lingering sensation that she wasn't alone. Not physically, the small flat was empty, her meager belongings undisturbed, but the awareness hummed in her chest like a second heartbeat. Lord Thornwood, she could feel him even now, distant but present, like a candle flame glimpsed through fog. Sleeping, she realized, or whatever vampires did during daylight hours, the presence felt dormant, quiet, lacking the sharp alertness she'd sensed the night before. She pushed herself upright, wincing at the soreness in her muscles. Her left palm caught her eye. The mark of House Thornwood was barely visible in the morning light, just a faint silvery trace against her skin. But when she touched it, warmth bloomed beneath her fingertips, and that awareness of him strengthened for just a moment before settling back to its baseline hum. The clock on her mantel read 2:30. She'd slept nearly 12 hours. Alina spent the afternoon in a daze, moving through the rituals of ordinary life, while her mind churned with impossible memories. Vampires, blood bonds, ancient houses playing games with mortal lives. Every time she tried to convince herself it had been a fever dream, the mark on her palm pulsed warm and real. She stood in her small kitchen, staring at the violin case, gathering dust in the corner. 3 months since she'd last played. 3 months since her world had collapsed around a lie she couldn't disprove. On impulse, she crossed to the case and opened it. The violin gleamed in the afternoon light, polished and perfect and silent. She lifted it, settled it beneath her chin, raised the bow and froze. What if her hands had forgotten? What if the music was gone, stolen along with her reputation and career? The mark on her palm flared suddenly warm, and through the bond she felt something, a pulse of encouragement, perhaps, or recognition. Lord Thornwood was still dormant, still distant, but some part of him had responded to her fear. Alina drew the bow across the strings. The note that sang out was pure and clear, achingly familiar. Her fingers remembered even if her heart had doubted. She played a simple scale, then a more complex run, then finally a piece she'd written herself years ago. Music she knew no one could accuse her of stealing because it had never been performed publicly, never been shared beyond her own private practice. She played until her fingers ached and tears ran freely down her face. Played until the grief and anger and fear of the past months poured out through the strings. Played until the sun began its descent toward the horizon and the awareness in her chest stirred, sharpening as Lord Thornwood woke to the night. The knock at her door came precisely at sunset. James, the servant from the night before, waited in the hallway. He was perhaps 30, with kind eyes and the careful posture of someone who'd learned to make himself invisible. The mark on his wrist was clearly visible now, in the lamplight. "Miss Ashford," he said, with a slight bow. "Are you ready?" Alina had changed into a simple dark dress, practical and unadorned. She'd pinned her hair back severely and left off the gloves. There seemed little point in hiding the mark now. "As ready as I can be." The carriage ride to House Thornwood took 20 minutes through London's evening streets. Alina watched the city pass by the window, ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. completely unaware of the predators walking among them. How many of these people knew the truth? How many bore marks like hers, bound to houses she'd never heard of? How long have you been bonded? She asked James suddenly. He glanced at her, surprised by the direct question. 5 years, Miss, since I was 23. Do you regret it? James was quiet for a moment, considering. No, Miss, Lord Thornwood saved my life. I was dying of consumption when he found me. The bond stabilized my health, gave me purpose. He's fair, by vampire standards, kinder than most, but you're still bound to him, still trapped. With respect, Miss Weir, all trapped by something. Poverty, illness, circumstance. James met her gaze steadily. At least this trap comes with protection and purpose. That's more than I had before. Alina had no answer to that. She understood it too well. The way survival sometimes meant accepting chains because the alternative was worse. The carriage stopped before the Thornwood estate. In daylight, it would have looked like any other aristocratic London house, elegant, imposing, respectable. But in the gathering darkness, with her new awareness thrumming in her chest, Alina could sense the otherness of it. This was a place built for creatures that didn't need warmth or light, that moved through shadows like smoke. James led her not to the grand entrance but to a side door, down a corridor she hadn't seen the night before. They descended stone steps into what could only be described as catacombs and changed passages carved beneath the house, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Lord Thornwood's private chambers are below, James explained. Sunlight never reaches here. It's safer for him, and for his work. They stopped before a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron. James knocked twice, then stepped back. Come, Lord Thornwood's voice called from within. Alina entered, alone. The chamber was surprisingly warm, a large room, lined with bookshelves, dominated by a massive desk covered in papers and maps. A fire burned in the hearth despite the mild evening, and comfortable chairs were arranged near it. Lord Thornwood stood by the desk, dressed more simply than he'd been at the ball, dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing pale forearms marked with scars so old they'd faded to silver. Alina, he gestured to one of the chairs. Sit, we have much to discuss and limited time. Limited. She settled into the chair, acutely aware of his presence, now the bond singing between them, so much stronger here, in close quarters. A delegation from House Ravencrest arrives in 3 days to formally challenge your bonding. His expression was grim. They claim I've violated protocol by bonding with an uninvited mortal without proper vetting. If they succeed, they can demand I release you into their custody. Elena's blood ran cold. What would they do with me? Nothing pleasant. Lord Thornwood moved to stand by the fire, his profile sharp in the flames. Which means you have 3 days to learn everything you can about our world. 3 days to become someone who can defend herself in a vampire court. 3 days to prove you deserve the protection I've offered. He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something that might have been regret. I'm sorry, Alina. I know it isn't enough time, but it's all we have. Chapter 7. The weight of centuries. Elena's hands gripped the armrests of her chair. 3 days. You're telling me I have 3 days to learn an entire world's worth of rules, or I'll be handed over to House Ravencrest like property. Yes. Lord Thornwood's honesty was brutal. I won't lie to you about the stakes. What happens if they take me? He was quiet for a moment, and through the bond Alina felt something dark and furious rise in him, before he forced it down. House Ravencrest is old and cruel. They view mortals as livestock useful for blood and breeding, nothing more. They would drain you, slowly, over months, extracting every drop of information about me they could find, then discard what remained. Elena's stomach churned. Can't you just refuse? Fight them, not without triggering a house war. The laws exist for a reason without them. We would tear each other apart and expose our existence to the mortal world in the process. He moved away from the fire, pacing like a caged predator. But if you can demonstrate knowledge, value, composure, if you can prove you understand our world and aren't simply a liability, they'll have no grounds for challenge. So, I need to become an expert on vampire politics in 72 hours. Alina heard the hysteria creeping into her voice and fought it down. That's impossible. Perhaps. He stopped before her chair, looking down at her with those ancient eyes. But you're still here, Alina. You haven't run screaming or collapsed in despair. You played music this afternoon, even though your world is falling apart. That suggests more resilience than you credit yourself with. She stared at him. You felt that, the music, through the bond, not the notes themselves, but the emotion behind them, your grief, your determination. Something softened in his expression. It reminded me why I chose to protect you. The admission hung between them, intimate and unexpected. Alina looked away first, heat rising to her cheeks. Then, teach me, whatever I need to know. Lord Thornwood pulled a chair closer and sat, eliminating the height difference. We'll start with the basics. There are 7 great houses in London, each controlling different territories. House Thornwood, which you now know. House Ravencrest, who will challenge us. House Blackwell, House Marguerite, House Silverthorn, House Ashenhurst, and House Draven. Lady Marguerite has her own house. She does. Don't let her beauty fool you. She's nearly as old as I am, and twice as ruthless. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. Each house operates under the Covenant, a set of laws established over 1,000 years ago. The most important law for your purposes is the law of binding. No vampire may bond with a mortal without that mortal's informed consent and without verification that the mortal understands what they're agreeing to. Elena's eyes narrowed. But I didn't understand. Not really. Doesn't that invalidate our bond? Technically, yes. Which is exactly what House Ravencrest will argue. His jaw tightened. They'll claim I coerced you, that you couldn't have given informed consent without prior knowledge of our world. They're not wrong, Alina. I took a risk bonding with you so quickly. Why did you? The question burst from her. Why not just send me away? Let another house claim me. Why risk your position for a mortal you'd never met? Lord Thornwood was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. Because when you walked into that ballroom, you were the only person in the room who looked at the music instead of the monster playing it. Everyone else saw Lord Thornwood, master vampire, political player. You saw grief in a morning song for an old friend. He met her gaze. It's been a very long time since anyone saw me as anything other than what I am. The raw honesty of it stole Elena's breath. She understood that loneliness had felt it herself these past months, surrounded by people who saw only scandal and disgrace instead of the woman beneath. I'm sorry, she said quietly, for what happened to you. The woman you couldn't save. Pain flickered across his features. Her name was Catherine, not Lady Blackwell that came later, when Thomas turned her rather than let her die. She was 16 when I failed her. He looked away. 300 years, and I still see her face. Alina reached out without thinking, her marked palm covering his hand where it rested on the chair arm. The bond flared warm between them, and she felt his surprise, his carefully controlled grief, the weight of centuries pressing down on him. 3 days, she said firmly. Teach me everything. I won't let you fail again because I wasn't strong enough or smart enough to survive their challenge. Lord Thornwood looked at their joined hands, then back at her face. Something shifted in his expression, respect perhaps, or the beginning of trust. Very well. But understand, Elena, this will be intensive. I'll push you harder than you've ever been pushed. There will be no rest, no mercy, no allowances made for mortal limitations. Good, Elena lifted her chin. I'm tired of being treated as fragile. Show me what I need to become. He smiled, then a real smile, small and brief but genuine. Then let's begin with the most critical lesson, how to recognize the different types of vampires and what each type is capable of. For the next 4 hours, Lord Thornwood lectured while Alina absorbed information like a drowning woman gulping air. She learned that vampires weren't all the same, that age brought power, that some could compel mortal minds while others couldn't, that certain bloodlines carried unique abilities, passed down through their makers. She learned the formal titles and modes of address, the intricate dance of vampire courtesy that could mean the difference between alliance and insult. She learned which houses were allies and which were barely restrained enemies, which vampires respected mortal life, and which viewed humans as prey. And she learned about blood bonds, not just her own, but the full spectrum of connections that tied mortals and vampires together. Simple bonds like hers, offering protection in exchange for occasional feeding. Deeper bonds that granted enhanced strength or limited immortality. And the rarest bond of all, the turning, where a mortal died and rose as something else entirely. Could you turn me? Alina asked, during a brief pause. If House Ravencrest's challenge succeeds, could you transform me before they take me? Lord Thornwood's expression darkened. I could, but I won't. Turning is a last resort, Alina. It erases who you are, and rebuilds you as something new. You would lose your mortality, your music, possibly your very soul. He shook his head. I won't damn you to this existence unless you beg me for it, and I have no other choice. Chapter 8. Blood and Strategy. Dawn was approaching when Lord Thornwood finally called a halt to the lessons. Elena's head ached with information overload: names, titles, territorial boundaries, feeding protocols, the intricate hierarchy of vampire society. Her hand cramped from taking notes, and exhaustion had settled into her bones like lead. Enough, Lord Thornwood said, noting the way she swayed in her chair. You need rest. James will take you home. No. Elena forced herself upright. You said 3 days. We've already lost 1 night. And you'll be useless tomorrow if you collapse from exhaustion. His tone was firm but not unkind. This isn't mortal stubbornness I'm indulging, Elena. This is strategy. The Ravencrest delegation will be looking for any sign of weakness. If you appear before them exhausted and scattered, they'll exploit it. He was right. Damn him. Elena's thoughts were already beginning to blur at the edges, facts bleeding together into useless confusion. When do I return? Sunset tomorrow. We'll continue your education and begin practical exercises. He stood, moving to his desk and retrieving a leather-bound journal. Take this. It contains everything we discussed tonight, plus additional details on each house. Study it during the day. Elena accepted the journal, noting the elegant script that filled its pages. You wrote this over many years. Consider it your survival manual. He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. There's one more thing we need to address before you leave. The blood debt. Elena's hand went instinctively to her throat. You said once a month, under normal circumstances. Yes, but the bonding ritual took more from both of us than a standard agreement would. I need to feed from you soon, within the next day or two, to fully stabilize the connection. His expression was carefully neutral. I can wait until tomorrow evening if you prefer to be rested, but it can't be delayed longer than that. The thought of his teeth in her throat made Elena's pulse jump. Fear and something else she didn't want to examine too closely. Will it hurt? Not if I do it properly. There's a technique. Vampire saliva contains compounds that numb pain and induce pleasure. It's an evolutionary adaptation. Prey that associates feeding with pleasure is more likely to submit willingly. He held her gaze. I mention this not to frighten you, but so you understand what will happen. Your body will respond. It doesn't mean you want it or that you're weak. It's simply biology. Elena appreciated the clinical explanation even as her cheeks burned. Tomorrow evening, then, after we continue the lessons. Agreed. Lord Thornwood moved toward the door, then paused. Elena, you're doing remarkably well. Most mortals would have broken by now. I've already been broken once, she said quietly. I learned it doesn't kill you. It just shows you what you're made of. Something flickered in his ancient eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit who understood the architecture of survival. Then he opened the door and called for James. The carriage ride home passed in a blur. Elena clutched the journal to her chest, acutely aware of Lord Thornwood's presence fading as distance grew between them. The bond stretched but didn't break, settling into something like background music, always there, not always noticed, but impossible to completely ignore. She stumbled into her flat as the first light of dawn painted the sky pink and gold. The journal fell to her bed as she collapsed beside it, too exhausted even to undress properly. Sleep claimed her immediately. She dreamed of ballrooms and blood, of eyes that glowed in the darkness and hands that were too cold to be human. She dreamed of Lord Thornwood playing his morning song, but this time, she was the one weeping beside the piano, grieving for something she couldn't name. She woke in early afternoon with sunlight streaming across her face and the bond humming peacefully in her chest. Lord Thornwood was dormant again, resting through the daylight hours. The awareness of him was different during his sleep, less sharp, more like sensing the presence of a large animal hibernating nearby. Dangerous, but temporarily contained. Elena forced herself out of bed and into her small kitchen. She made tea and toast, then settled at her table with the journal Lord Thornwood had given her. The entries were meticulous, spanning decades, notes on each house's leadership, their known territories, their traditional feeding grounds, detailed accounts of old feuds and fragile alliances, observations about individual vampires, their temperaments, their weaknesses, their preferred prey. One entry made her pause. Lady Marguerite of House Marguerite, 452 years old, maker, unknown, specialty, seduction and political manipulation, feeds exclusively from artists and musicians, claims their blood carries more nuanced flavors. Dangerous has petitioned the Covenant 3 times to expand her territory into my holdings, each time denied. She will not stop. Advise extreme caution with any mortal bonded to my house. She views them as potential leverage or prizes to steal. Elena's hand went to her marked palm. She was a musician, exactly the type of prey Lady Marguerite preferred. She kept reading, absorbing everything. The journal revealed a mind that thought in decades rather than days, that saw patterns invisible to mortal perception. But it also revealed something else. The entries were written in a precise, elegant hand that never wavered, never revealed emotion. But the fact that they existed at all, that Lord Thornwood had spent years documenting this world as if he might need to explain it to someone someday, spoke of a hope he'd never quite abandoned. Hope that he wouldn't be alone forever. As afternoon bled into evening, Alina felt the bond strengthen. Lord Thornwood was waking. She sensed his awareness, sharpening, focusing, and then unexpectedly reaching toward her through the connection. Not intrusively, more like a question. Are you well? Alina touched her marked palm, wondering if he could feel her response through the bond. I'm here, I'm studying. She didn't know if he received it, but the bond pulsed warmly, almost like approval or relief. The knock came at her door precisely at sunset. This time, Alina was ready. She'd dressed in practical clothing, a dark skirt and simple blouse that would allow easy movement. She'd pinned her hair back severely and tucked the journal into a leather satchel. She looked like what she was, a student preparing for the most important examination of her life. James waited in the hallway. But this time he wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, tall, elderly, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see through pretense. The mark on her wrist was so old it had faded to barely visible. Miss Ashford, the woman said, her voice crisp with authority. I am Margaret, House Thornwood's seneschal, and Lord Thornwood's oldest living bond. I understand you have 3 days to become someone worth protecting. I'm here to ensure you don't waste a single hour of them. Chapter 9. Trial by fire. Margaret's assessment was ruthless and immediate. In the carriage, she circled Alina like a hawk evaluating prey, noting every nervous gesture, every uncertain glance. Posture, Margaret snapped. You slouch, like someone expecting to be struck. Straighten your spine. In 3 days, you'll stand before vampires who can smell fear like blood and water. Alina straightened reflexively, years of performance training kicking in. Better. Now tell me the 7 great houses and their current lords. Alina rattled them off, grateful for the hours she'd spent with the journal. House Thornwood, Lord Lucian Thornwood. House Ravencrest, Lord Dimitri Raven. House Blackwell, Lady Catherine Blackwell. House Marguerite, Lady Marguerite. Full names, Margaret interrupted. Lady Marguerite. Details matter. A single error before the Covenant Tribunal and they'll use it to question everything else you claim to know. The interrogation continued throughout the journey. Margaret's questions were relentless. Vampire feeding law, territorial protocols, the proper forms of address for vampires of different ages and ranks. Every mistake earned a sharp correction. Every hesitation was noted and exploited by the time they arrived at the Thornwood estate. Elena's confidence had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt on sturdier foundations. Margaret wasn't cruel, she realized. She was preparing Alina for something far worse than harsh questions in a carriage. Lord Thornwood waited in his underground chambers, but tonight the room had been transformed. The comfortable chairs were gone, replaced by a formal arrangement that mimicked a Covenant Tribunal, a raised seat for the presiding lord, flanking positions for witnesses, and a single chair in the center where the accused would stand trial. We're going to simulate tomorrow night, Lord Thornwood said without preamble. He'd dressed formally severe black that made him look even more inhuman, more ancient. Margaret will play Lady Catherine Blackwell, who chairs the tribunal. James will represent House Silver. I'll take the role of Lord Ravencrest, who brings the challenge. Elena's stomach dropped. You're going to argue against me. I'm going to eviscerate every weakness in your knowledge and composure, because that's exactly what Dimitri will do. His expression was hard, showing none of the gentleness he'd revealed the night before. If you break here, in private, we can repair the damage. If you break before the tribunal, you're lost. Do you understand? Yes. Alina moved to the center chair, forcing herself not to fidget. Then, let us begin. Lord Thornwood's voice dropped into something colder, more formal. He no longer looked at her with recognition but with the predatory assessment of an enemy seeking weakness. Miss Elena Ashford, mortal bonded to House Thornwood. You stand accused of entering into a blood bond without informed consent. thereby invalidating said bond under covenant law. How do you answer? Elena's mouth was dry. She'd prepared for this, had rehearsed arguments in her mind, but the weight of 3 ancient predators staring at her drove every coherent thought from her head. The bond was voluntary. Speak up, Margaret. Lady Blackwell commanded from her elevated seat. The tribunal cannot hear mumbling. Alina cleared her throat, forcing volume into her voice. I entered the bond voluntarily, with full knowledge. Lord Thornwood stepped closer, and Alina had to fight every instinct not to retreat. You claim to have possessed full knowledge of vampire society, law, and custom before accepting Lord Thornwood's bond, when by your own admission, you'd never encountered our kind before that evening. I was informed of the terms you couldn't possibly have understood without context. His voice was scalpel sharp, cutting through her defense. You were a frightened mortal, cornered and desperate. Lord Thornwood exploited that desperation to secure a bond that serves his political interests. Is this not accurate? No. The word burst from Alina. Anger, finally, overwhelming fear. Lord Thornwood offered me protection when I needed it. Yes, but he explained the risks. He gave me choice when he could have simply taken choice. Lord Thornwood's laugh was cruel. What choice exists when the alternative is death? You were coerced by circumstance, if not by his direct action. The bond is invalid. Then, what would you have me do? Alina stood, unable to remain seated under his assault. Should I have chosen death? Chosen to be drained by whichever house found me first? I made the best decision I could with the information I had, and I've spent every hour since learning what I need to know to honor that choice. If the bond is invalid because I was ignorant, then teach me. Test me, but don't tell me I'm powerless simply because I'm mortal. Silence filled the chamber. Lord Thornwood's expression didn't change, but through the bond, Alina felt something shift, a pulse of fierce satisfaction, quickly suppressed. And what precisely have you learned, Miss Ashford? Convince this tribunal that you're more than a liability to House Thornwood. Alina took a breath, then another. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't hide them. I've learned that vampire society operates under the covenant, established in the year 1047 by the Council of Seven. I've learned that blood bonds exist in 3 primary forms: protection bonds, like mine, enhancement bonds that grant limited abilities, and the turning itself. I've learned that feeding requires consent, that territory must be respected, and that exposure of vampire existence to the general mortal population is punishable by final death. She locked eyes with him, refusing to look away. I've learned that House Ravencrest views mortals as property and has territorial ambitions in eastern London that House Thornwood has blocked for decades. I've learned that this challenge isn't actually about me or the validity of my bond, about Lord Dimitri trying to find leverage to force territorial concessions. You accuse a great house, Lord, of ulterior motives, Margaret interjected, though Alina caught the hint of approval in her voice. I observe patterns and draw conclusions, Lady Blackwell. If my observations are incorrect, then I invite correction from those with greater wisdom. Alina inclined her head respectfully. But if they're accurate, then this tribunal should question why House Ravencrest suddenly cares about proper bonding protocols when they've ignored countless violations within their own territory. Lord Thornwood circled her slowly. You've been studying. I've been surviving. There's a difference. Alina turned to track his movement. I won't pretend to know everything about your world. I've had 3 days, but I know enough to understand what's at stake. And I know I won't let House Ravencrest use me as a pawn in their political games. Strong words from a mortal who could be drained dry in seconds. Then drain me. Alina lifted her chin, exposing her throat. Prove that I'm nothing but prey. Or acknowledge that I'm more than that I'm intelligent enough, determined enough, and resilient enough to be worth the protection Lord Thornwood offered. The silence stretched impossibly long. Then Margaret began to clap slowly, the sound echoing off the stone walls. Well done, Miss Ashford. That was a performance worthy of the stage. Lord Thornwood's cold mask cracked, revealing the man beneath. Pride glowed in his eyes. Indeed, you may actually survive tomorrow after all. Chapter 10, The Blood Debt. The mock tribunal dissolved. Margaret gathered her things with a satisfied nod, while James began restoring the room to its usual arrangement. But Alina remained standing in the center, adrenaline still coursing through her veins, hands trembling now that the performance was over. Lord Thornwood approached, his expression softer than it had been during the interrogation. You did well, better than well. You were magnificent. I was terrified, Alina admitted. I know, I felt it through the bond. He gestured toward one of the chairs James had replaced. But you used that fear instead of letting it use you. That's the difference between surviving and merely enduring. Alina sank into the chair, suddenly exhausted. The past 3 days had been a blur of information and pressure, sleep deprivation, and constant vigilance. What if it's not enough? What if Lord Ravencrest asks something I don't know? Then you admit ignorance gracefully and turn it into an opportunity to demonstrate humility and willingness to learn. Lord Thornwood took the chair opposite her. The tribunal isn't looking for perfection, Alina. They're looking for evidence that you understand what you've entered into, and that you're capable of honoring the bond's responsibilities. Margaret paused at the door. The girl has steel in her spine. Lucian, more than most mortals I've seen. She do. With that pronouncement, she swept from the room, James following behind her. The door closed, leaving Alina alone with Lord Thornwood. The silence between them felt different now, charged with awareness, heavy with the thing they'd been avoiding, the blood debt. Elena's pulse jumped as she remembered his words from the night before. I need to feed from you soon to stabilize the connection. We should address the other matter, Lord Thornwood said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Perhaps through the bond, he could. I can wait until after the tribunal if you prefer, but it would be better now. Alina forced the word out before courage failed her. Let's do it now. I'm already terrified from the mock trial. Might as well deal with all my fears at once. A faint smile touched his lips. That's one approach, certainly. He stood, moving to the fireplace where shadows danced across his features. Come here, Alina. She rose on unsteady legs and crossed to him. This close, she could see the inhuman perfection of him, skin too smooth, eyes to knowing, the predatory stillness that no mortal could achieve. The bond thrummed between them, her mortality singing against his eternity, where her voice came out barely a whisper. Your wrist is easiest for a first feeding. The throat is more intimate, more intense. We can work toward that if the bond requires deeper connection later. He held out his hand. May I? The formality of the request, the careful seeking of permission, steadied her. Alina placed her left hand in his, the marked palm warm where their skin touched. Lord Thornwood cradled her wrist gently, his thumb finding her pulse point. Your heart is racing. I'm frightened, I know. He met her eyes. I'm going to bite here. His finger traced the spot on the inside of her wrist, and take approximately 6 ounces of blood. Enough to strengthen the bond but not enough to weaken you significantly. The numbing compounds in my saliva will take effect almost immediately. You may feel dizzy or euphoric. That's normal. If at any point you want me to stop, say the word sanctuary, and I'll release you immediately. Do you understand? Sanctuary, Alina repeated. I understand. Then close your eyes if you wish. Some find it easier not to watch. But Alina kept her eyes open. She needed to see this, needed to witness what she'd agreed to. Lord Thornwood held her gaze for a moment longer, then lowered his head to her wrist. His lips were cool against her skin. Alina felt the press of his mouth, the gentle scrape of teeth positioning themselves, and then the bite was sharper than she'd expected, a bright lance of pain that made her gasp. But almost instantly, warmth flooded the wound, radiating up her arm and into her chest. The pain transformed into something else, not quite pleasure but not suffering either, a strange, dizzy sweetness that made her knees weak. Through the bond, she felt his response, the satisfaction of hunger being sated, the taste of her blood on his tongue, and beneath it something warmer, gratitude, tenderness, a fierce protectiveness that wrapped around her like armor. Lord Thornwood drank with careful control, his hand supporting her wrist, his other arm sliding around her waist to steady her as the room began to tilt. Elena's free hand gripped his shoulder, and she felt the cool solidity of him, the strength held so carefully in check. Time stretched and condensed. It might have been seconds or minutes. Alina floated in the strange space between awareness and drugged bliss, feeling the pull of his mouth, the beat of her own heart pushing blood toward him, the bond singing between them with new intensity. Then he lifted his head, his tongue sealing the wound. Where his teeth had pierced, 2 small marks remained, already beginning to heal with unnatural speed. Done, he murmured, though he didn't immediately release her. How do you feel? Alina swayed against him, the euphoria making everything soft at the edges. Strange, warm, like I've had too much wine. That will pass in a few minutes. His arm tightened around her waist, guiding her back to the chair. He knelt beside it, keeping one hand on her shoulder, as if afraid she might topple over. The first feeding is always the most disorienting. Alina looked at him, really looked, and saw the change. His skin had more color now, his eyes brighter. He looked more alive, more human, fed on her mortality. Did I taste good? The question came out without thought, the euphoria loosening her tongue. Lord Thornwood's expression flickered with surprise, then amusement, then something darker. Yes, he said softly. You taste of music and defiance, of grief, transmuted into strength. He paused. You taste like survival, Alina. It's intoxicating. The intimacy of those words, the raw honesty, made Alina's breath catch. Through the bond, she felt his hunger not for her blood now, but for something else, connection, understanding, the simple human comfort of being seen by another soul, even if that soul happened to beat in a mortal body while his had stopped centuries ago. Thank you, she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. The care during feeding, perhaps, or the protection, or simply the truth, when lies would have been easier. Lord Thornwood's hand moved from her shoulder to her cheek. A gesture so gentle it seemed impossible from a creature built for violence. No, Alina, thank you, for trusting me with this, for not running when you had every reason to flee. His thumb traced her cheekbone, and Alina leaned into the touch before she could stop herself. The bond pulsed between them, warm and alive, binding mortal and immortal in ways neither had fully anticipated. Tomorrow night, he said, his voice rough with some emotion she couldn't name, we face the tribunal together. Whatever comes, know that I will fight for you with everything I have. I know, Alina said, and meant it. Chapter 11, The Tribunal's Verdict. The Covenant Tribunal convened in a chamber Alina hadn't seen before, ancient, stone walls carved with symbols that predated modern language, lit by hundreds of candles that cast writhing shadows across the vaulted ceiling, 7 thrones arranged in a semicircle, each occupied by a vampire so old their presence pressed against her like physical weight. Alina stood in the center, alone. Lord Thornwood had been required to take his position among the other house lords, leaving her to face judgment without his physical presence, but the bond hummed steadily in her chest. A lifeline of silent support. Lady Catherine Blackwell presided from the central throne. Her violet gown, the same shade she'd worn at the ball, the elderly woman who'd wept at Lucien's music, now radiated authority that made Elena's knees weak. This tribunal is convened. Lady Blackwell's voice rang through the chamber, to hear House Ravencrest's challenge regarding the bond between Lord Lucian Thornwood and the mortal Alina Ashford. Lord Dimitri, present your case. Lord Ravencrest rose from his throne, tall, pale-haired, with eyes like chips of ice. He moved with liquid grace to stand before Alina, circling her like a shark scenting blood. Honored tribunal, he began, his accent thick with old Russian inflections. I challenge this bond on grounds of invalid consent. Miss Ashford entered Lord Thornwood's protection without prior knowledge of our existence, our laws, or the true nature of blood bonds. She was coerced by fear and circumstance, making any agreement fundamentally unsound. Murmurs rippled through the assembled vampires who filled the chamber's periphery. Alina felt dozens of predatory gazes assessing her, waiting for her to crumble. Furthermore, Lord Ravencrest continued, Lord Thornwood's haste in bonding suggests ulterior motives. Perhaps Miss Ashford possesses some quality he wished to secure before other houses could evaluate her worth. This secrecy violates the spirit of covenant law, which requires transparency in all mortal bonds. Lady Blackwell's gaze shifted to Lord Thornwood. How do you answer these charges, Lord Thornwood? Lucian stood, and Alina felt his calm determination through the bond. I answered that Miss Ashford's ignorance at the time of bonding was unfortunate but not disqualifying. The covenant requires informed consent. Yes, but it does not specify the timing of that information. Miss Ashford has spent the past 3 days immersing herself in our laws and customs. She understands now what she agreed to then. Convenient rationalization, Lord Ravencrest sneered. By that logic, any vampire could bond with an ignorant mortal and simply claim education occurred afterward. Which is why, Lady Blackwell interjected, we must hear from Miss Ashford herself. Her ancient eyes fixed on Alina. Speak, child. Do you claim to understand what you've entered into? Do you consent to this bond freely, knowing what it costs? Elena's throat was dry, but she forced herself to meet Lady Blackwell's gaze. This was the moment everything hinged on. 3 days of preparation distilled into whatever words she could find. I claim understanding, Lady Blackwell, though I acknowledge it remains incomplete. I've learned your laws, your history, the structure of your houses, I understand that my bond to Lord Thornwood requires discretion, service, and blood. I understand that I've traded mortal freedom for immortal protection." She paused, gathering courage. "But I also understand something, Lord. Ravencrest seems to have forgotten that ignorance and innocence are not the same as incapacity." Lord Ravencrest's eyes narrowed dangerously. I dare to speak truth before this tribunal." Alina cut him off, her voice stronger now. "Yes, I was ignorant when I accepted Lord Thornwood's bond, but I was not stupid. I recognized danger. I assessed my options. I chose survival and accepted the cost. If this tribunal invalidates every decision made under duress, then half the bonds in this room become questionable. How many mortals choose your world freely versus choosing it over death or suffering?" Shocked silence filled the chamber. Through the bond, Alina felt Lucian's fierce pride mixed with concern. She was walking a razor's edge between brilliance and suicide. Lady Marguerite leaned forward from her throne, emerald eyes glittering. "The girl makes a fair point. Most mortals who enter our world do so fleeing something worse. Shall we invalidate centuries of bonds based on that standard?" "This is different," Lord Ravencrest insisted. "Lord Thornwood deliberately bonded with an uninformed mortal to circumvent proper evaluation." Or Alina interrupted again, her fear transmuting into anger. "Lord Thornwood acted quickly to save my life when another vampire might have simply fed and discarded me. Should the Covenant punish mercy, discourage protection in favor of predation?" "Mercy?" Lord Ravencrest laughed coldly. "You think this is mercy? You're a pawn, Miss Ashford. A political tool Lord Thornwood will use and discard when convenient. He's done it before." Alina felt Lucien's rage spike through the bond, but she kept her voice level. "If I'm a pawn, Lord Ravencrest, then what does that make this challenge? Because from where I stand, you're not concerned about my welfare or the validity of my consent. You're concerned that Lord Thornwood gained an asset you couldn't evaluate or counterbid for. This isn't about protecting mortals. It's about territory and power, wrapped in false concern for my autonomy." Lord Ravencrest's hand shot out, gripping her throat with inhuman speed. His fingers were iron bands, cutting off her air. "You overstep, mortal releaser." Lord Thornwood's voice cracked like a whip. He was on his feet, power radiating from him in waves that made the candles flicker. "Now, Dimitri, or answer the challenge I will issue for laying hands on my bonded ward." For a long moment, no one moved. Alina couldn't breathe, spots dancing in her vision, but she refused to struggle or show fear. Through the bond, she sent everything she had toward Lucian, not distress, but defiance. "Trust." Lady Blackwell's voice cut through the tension. "Lord Raven, release the girl, immediately." Lord Ravencrest's fingers loosened, then dropped away. Alina gasped air into her burning lungs, her hand going to her bruised throat. But she remained standing, meeting his icy gaze without flinching. "This tribunal has seen enough," Lady Blackwell declared. "Miss Ashford has demonstrated knowledge, composure, and courage well beyond what most bonded mortals achieve in years, let alone days." Furthermore, Lord Ravencrest's violence toward her during these proceedings reveals the true nature of this challenge. House Ravencrest seeks not to protect a mortal, but to undermine House Thornwood's standing. She rose from her throne, and every vampire in the chamber rose with her. The challenge is denied. The bond between Lord Lucian Thornwood and Miss Elena Ashford is affirmed as valid and binding under Covenant law. This tribunal is concluded. Epilogue. A new dawn. The tribunal chamber emptied slowly. Vampires departing in clusters of whispered conversation and sidelong glances. Alina remained in the center of the room, her throat still aching from Lord Ravencrest's grip. Her hands trembling now that the performance was over. She'd won. They'd won. The bond was legitimate. Her place in this world secured, at least for now. Lord Thornwood materialized at her side with that unnerving speed, his hand immediately going to her throat to examine the bruises already forming. His touch was gentle, but through the bond Elena felt his rage, a cold, controlled fury that made her shiver. "He will answer for this," Lucian said quietly. "Striking another lord's bonded ward during tribunal proceedings violates 3 separate Covenant laws. Lady Blackwell will require restitution." "I don't want vengeance." Elena's voice was hoarse. "I want to go home and sleep for a week." His expression softened slightly. "A reasonable desire. But first," he turned as Lady Blackwell approached, her elderly face unreadable. "Miss Ashford," Lady Blackwell said, studying Alina with those ancient eyes, "you surprised me tonight. Most mortals would have crumbled under Dimitri's assault. You stood your ground and spoke truth to power. That takes either tremendous courage or tremendous foolishness. Probably both, my lady, Alina managed. Lady Blackwell's lips twitched. Indeed, Lucian, you've chosen well this time. Don't waste it. She paused, then added more quietly, Catherine would have liked her. The girl has her fire. I know, Lucian said, and Alina felt the weight of old grief through the bondwoman he'd failed to save, the debt he'd spent 3 centuries trying to repay. Lady Blackwell departed, leaving them alone in the vast chamber. The candles had begun to gutter, shadows deepening in the corners. Alina swayed, exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline. Easy. Lucian's arm slid around her waist, supporting her weight. Let's get you somewhere more comfortable. He guided her not toward the exit but to a side door that opened onto a private gallery. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating portraits of vampires long gone to dust. Lucian settled Alina onto a cushioned bench, then sat beside her, maintaining respectful distance despite the bond humming between them. You were magnificent, he said quietly. The way you turned Dimitri's arguments against him, the way you challenged the tribunal itself. I've seen ancient vampires with less political acumen. I was terrified the entire time, Alina admitted. I just didn't let it show. That's the definition of courage. His gaze was intent on her face. You understand what you've done tonight, don't you? You've made yourself visible to every house in London. Some will respect you for it. Others will see you as a threat to be eliminated or a prize to be stolen. I know. Alina touched the mark on her palm, feeling its warmth. But I also know I can't live in fear of what might happen. I tried that after the scandal, after losing my music career. It didn't protect MIT, just made me smaller. Lucian was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried an honesty that made her chest ache. I brought you into this world to protect you, Alina, but somewhere over these past 3 days, it became about more than duty or old guilt. You've reminded me what it means to fight for something beyond mere survival. To hope again. Alina turned to face him fully. In the moonlight, he looked almost human, beautiful, and terrible, and impossibly sad. What happened to her? The real Catherine. I mean, not Lady Blackwell. She was a merchant's daughter, 16 years old, clever and kind, who stumbled onto a vampire feeding in an alley. His jaw tightened. I found her after, but too late. House Ravencrest had already drained her nearly dry. I begged Thomas Blackwell to turn her, to save what remained. He did, out of friendship to me, but the girl she'd been died that night. What rose 3 days later was someone new, someone who barely remembered being mortal. And you've been trying to save her ghost ever since, Alina said softly. Until you. Lucian's hand moved to cover hers, his cool fingers intertwining with her warm ones. You're not Catherine, Alina. You're fiercer, more stubborn, and far more reckless. But you've given me something I thought lost forever, the belief that protecting someone doesn't have to end in tragedy. Alina's breath caught. Through the bond, she felt the truth of his words, the vulnerability beneath his ancient control. This creature who'd lived for centuries, who commanded power and inspired fear, was offering her something precious. His trust, his hope, his carefully guarded heart. I can't promise I won't disappoint you, she whispered. I'm mortal, fragile, and I have no idea what I'm doing in your world. Then, we're well matched, because I have no idea what I'm doing in yours. A smile ghosted across his lips. Music, hope, defiance, these are mortal gifts I'd forgotten existed. You remind me every time our bond touches. It's unsettling and precious. Alina squeezed his hand. The bond pulsed between them, not the magical compulsion of master and servant, but something rarer, partnership, recognition of 2 wounded souls finding unexpected solace in each other. What happens now? She asked. After tonight. Now you learn to navigate this world on your own terms, not just mine. You'll attend house functions, meet with other bonded mortals, begin to build your own network of allies. Lucian's thumb traced patterns on her palm, over the mark that bound them. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, we'll discuss whether you want to remain mortal or choose something more permanent. You'd turn me, even after what you said about losing yourself. Only if you begged me. Only if mortality became unbearable and you chose immortality with full understanding of its cost. His eyes held hers. I won't take your humanity, Alina, but if you ever wish to set it down, I'll be here to catch you. The promise hung between them, weighty and sacred. Alina leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the cool solidity of him, the ancient strength wrapped around something unexpectedly tender. Through the tall windows, London stretched out in gaslit streets, and shadowed Eliza City that contained two worlds now, mortal and immortal, forever intertwined. "I want to play for you," she said suddenly. "A real performance, not just practice. Something that's mine, that no one can take away, or claim they wrote. I would like that very much." They sat together in the moonlight, vampire and mortal, predator and prey transformed into something neither had expected to find. The bond between them pulsed, steady and warm, not ownership, but choice, not possession, but partnership. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, Elena Ashford, musician, survivor, and now a recognized member of London's immortal society, finally allowed herself to rest. She'd survived the tribunal. She'd proven her worth. She'd walked into the vampire's world on her own terms and emerged not as a victim, but as someone with agency, voice, and the fierce determination to carve out her own place in the darkness. The real challenges would come later: political maneuvering, rival houses, the constant navigation between mortality and immortality. But for now, in this quiet moment, Elena had everything she needed: protection, purpose, and the unexpected gift of a connection that defied the boundaries between human and monster. Lord Lucian Thornwood had played a song for an elderly woman at a ball, unaware that fate would bring him something far more precious than he'd bargained for: a mortal woman who refused to be merely saved, who demanded instead to be seen, heard, and honored as an equal partner in an immortal world, and in the end, that made all the difference.